Welcome to the channel. My name's Marty Owings, and today we're going to take a look at these Winsor Newton Promarker watercolor markers. Promarker watercolor markers? Well, Winsor Newton has gone through a couple of iterations of their versions of the watercolor markers. This is a set of 12. We're going to take a look at each and every color, and we're going to do it on two different papers today. And I'm going to compare the Promarker watercolor markers that Winsor Newton makes today to the watercolor markers that Winsor Newton made in 2015 when I first got my hands on the original Winsor Newton watercolor markers, which you can find that review out on my channel. Just do a search for Winsor Newton watercolor markers, you'll find it. I absolutely loved them. They made it into my top 10 list of all-time best watercolors, period. Even though they were in marker form, they were just awesome. So we're going to see if anything's changed from then to today in the rebranding and all of that stuff, and we'll put this to the test. So I picked up this set here from Wet Paint, my local art store here. But if you go through the colors, you go onto Winsor Newton's website, they have 35 colors in this particular line of Promarker watercolor markers. They are a water-based marker, so not alcohol, water-based. They are touted as highly pigmented and light fast, just as they've kind of always marketed them. They had a run with a marker called Promarkers, not to be confused with Promarker watercolor markers, Promarkers, for a while, and I believe Winsor Newton discontinued them due to poor sales. I also did a review on those markers, which I did not like very much. Now, they were a different type of marker. Granted, they weren't a watercolor marker, so not to be confused, but if you are confused, that's okay. These particular markers, as they had originally, come with a dual tip. Now, originally, as I said back in 2015, I loved these markers, these Winsor Newton watercolor markers. The original ones, they were made in France. They were beautiful. They blended nicely. I was amazed, actually, really astounded by how well they did. These particular markers in the newest iteration, the form factor is exactly the same as it's always been. They didn't really change it size-wise or anything like that. The labeling is still the same, and everything in that regard is the same. Now, whether or not manufacturing changed, that might be a different matter. These are now made in China, these new ones, and we'll talk about cost and process and all that stuff in a little bit. But the one thing I wanted to make sure I did was test the solubility. Like when you put down a mark, how well does that mark dissolve? And the reason I wanted to do that was because in 2015, when I originally tested the watercolor markers made by Winsor Newton, that was one of their big strengths. So the minute you touched water to these watercolor marks on almost any type of paper, it just dissolved beautifully. There was no like remnants of the marker or anything like that. So I was really impressed by the original watercolor markers, as I've said. Now, this is just I just wanted to quick test this because I was excited to see whether or not there was the same solubility and things like that with this new marker. And I can tell right away that it's not quite the same. Now, I was thinking, well, maybe it's the paper. I'm using a cold press here, but in a minute I'll use a hot press and test all that out. What is kind of the same is the consistency of the colors. The colors look almost exactly as they did back in 2015, and they when you just mark with them in marker form, they're almost identical to those old markers. Now, I don't know if something changed in the solubility or something like that, but they are different. They are definitely different from my standpoint or from the standpoint of use here. So one of the things I I wanted to do is just get water on these colors here. And you can see here, I'm going to go through and just add water to all of these colors and see what happens, because this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. Now that light yellow or that lemon yellow, that was always a color that was very light, even in the original markers I tested, and I'll show you side by side here in a minute. But that didn't really change from 2015 to 2024 in the 9 years or so. Almost a decade, folks, almost a decade since I tested those. By the way, those original Winsor and Newton watercolor markers, I light fast tested those over like a year and a half, and they're almost exactly the same as they were when I originally swatched them out. So they were extremely light fast, and I really, that just made me love them even more, right? You just think to yourself, wow, how did they do this? This is brilliant. And again, those original watercolor markers were made in France. Now, I don't know if, like I said, the manufacturing process may be different, quality control could be different, but these markers did not perform the same for me. Now, I'm going to go to a hot press paper, which is a much smoother paper, thinking to myself, maybe a hot press paper would make a difference. You know, maybe I could see those colors a little bit more soluble on a smoother paper. And so, yeah, so that's what I wanted to do here, is just kind of test that out. So marker wise, putting down the marks and stuff, the colors, those all seem about the same. Those seem roughly the same as they did originally. They're bright colors, absolutely, in marker form. But again, now you can see when I put water on these, not the same, not the same marker. And I don't know if Winsor Newton would say, wait, we didn't change anything, everything's exactly the same. But I'm telling you, from an artist's experience and putting these down on paper, there is definitely a marked difference. So here's a comparison between the two. You can see how much better and soluble the water, the color is when I add water in the one from 2015. Now, originally, this is 2024. Blick is selling the basic set of 12 for $44. This is them right here. That's made in China, $45 US. Now, what I want to do is take a quick look at the Wayback Machine, and these were $42. They came in a nice tin case. They were made in France, and they were better, much better markers, in my opinion, much better watercolor markers. You could, hey, it's the eye test, right? You just look yourself and see. So, but, you know, to be fair, I wanted to do a little bit of mixing and drawing and maybe creating my own, watercolor sketch. One thing I did not do originally when I bought the markers in 2015, the old Winsor Newton watercolor markers, was I didn't take the time to mix them with other types of watercolors, so regular old watercolors from a tube or a pan. And so in this test, I'm going to do that as well in this video. But here I'm just going to try to mix the two. And again, solubility matters here, because when you mix paints or watercolors or colors like this, even if they're from a marker, you shouldn't see remnants of the old marks that you're making, right? If they're dissolvable, soluble, if they're made the way they were before. And this, as you can see, just didn't work. So yes, I got some green color from the blue and the yellow, but very, very almost indistinguishable from just smearing around muddy colors. A little better luck here trying to get the purple with red and blue. But again, it's very light compared to what you saw. And then I used the other end of the marker, the fine tip, and I wanted to just put a little color on there and see what would happen. And you can see very pronounced. The lines are there. There's nothing you can do about it. Whereas before, in 2015, those marks would just about disappear. You really couldn't see them very well. So that's what I liked about the old Winsor Newton. See, and here's just kind of a test. And, you know, it could be that maybe I'm doing something that I'm not supposed to with the markers or what have you. I'm not sure, but I'm running this test and swatching exactly the way I did basically in 2015. So very little variation. The paper is exactly the same on the cold press end. So, or I'm sorry, on the hot press end. So here's some regular old tube watercolor. This happens to be M gram that I had left over from a recent video. And so I just wanted to kind of make some, test it out here, see if they would mix nice with other watercolor. And they kind of do. I mean, if you dip it in and kind of use it as its own color on the sheet here, and then mix it with regular watercolor, the regular watercolor is a bit more dominant, which you might expect because the other thing is a marker, but yet and still it worked pretty well. Now, as far as getting rid of the marks when you mix with watercolor, about the same as regular water. So if you add regular water here and mix it, it's about the same. It's really not substantially different. And here the yellow, you can see the yellow mark underneath the watercolor paint is very pronounced, although I did get a really nice green. I think that's more a factor of having the really good watercolor from M gram being transparent. So now I'm just kind of trying to mix these colors in with this strip of sienna here, or burnt sienna. I can see, again, the marks are very pronounced. And yeah, I just did not have that experience with the original Winsor & Newton watercolor markers before they rebranded these as Pro markers. So I definitely don't feel that they got better, and in any case, I think they got markedly worse. Now here I just wanted to sketch out a quick little teeny tiny landscape. No big deal here. And by the way, for the record, if you've watched my channel for years and years, I love Winsor & Newton. They're a great company, very venerable maker. Heck, John Singer Sargent used their paints, back in the day. So they were, and they continue to be a great company that does invest a lot in good products, and I like that. But this is definitely, if I worked for Winsor & Newton, I'd say, hey, that's a redo. Let's look at the solubility. Let's really examine how that's working and take another shot at this, because the people who loved the original Winsor & Newton watercolor markers absolutely loved them. I mean, passionately, just a really great artist tool to have in your kit. And I use them all the time. I think I used all of the ones I had up, except for two. Maybe I might have two left around here, but yeah, over 9 years, I used them quite a bit, and I absolutely love them. From a use standpoint on a tiny sketch like this, this is a first world problem, really, honestly, because it's still a nice art supply. It's just not as nice as it used to be. And it's not as useful and blendable. And so I'm left with kind of a disappointment. And maybe it's unfair a little bit to Winsor & Newton because I'm comparing it to a product that I absolutely loved and was so happy to use all the time, and it just had great quality. And the solubility, like I said, it was like melt on touch. I mean, kudos for keeping the price down. It's comparable to what it was originally, but it's definitely not the same quality, not the same product from the product that was made in France. If I were Winsor & Newton, I would go back to the drawing board on these and see what I could do about getting back to that original formula. Well, this has been Marty for owingsart.com. Thanks for stopping by. So long. Art and Recipes from the St. Paul Underground Artists League is a book filled with more than 100 pages of spectacular artwork and recipes for delicious food you can fix yourself at home. The art in this book represents the work of 29 brilliant members and includes oil paintings, watercolors, gouache, ink, acrylic, and other media. It represents nationally and internationally recognized painters, cartoonists, watercolorists, urban sketchers, and illustrators. Open up this book to a world of colorful art and cooking. Get yours today by contacting one of the artists in the book or pick up a copy from our friends at Wet Paint on Grand Avenue in good old St. Paul. Thank you for supporting local artists, and from everyone at the St. Paul Underground Artists League, all the best and bon appetit.